And welcome into Weather Wagers, another week, another conversation about the offseason, including Penn State. So last week we offered in Audrey Snyder from The Athletic. This week we talked to Mark Wogenrich about some of the same topics, but also expanding upon Penn State's offseason and how it is so critical to look ahead and to stay competitive in the Big Ten. So we had a lovely conversation with Mark. Let's go ahead and roll that, and we'll talk a little bit more afterwards about what this all means for Penn State and looking ahead to this upcoming season.
And Dan, you sent me an article last week that was entitled "James Franklin Delivers an Invitation and a Call to Action to Penn State's Trustees." And the article got us talking, and now we wanted to chat with the author of that article. We welcome Mark Wogenrich to the podcast. Now, Mark is the publisher of All Penn State, a Fan Nation channel on the SI.com network. Mark, thanks. Welcome to Weather Wagers. We want to discuss this article and what it means. In your opinion, is Penn State ready to fully embrace James Franklin's vision?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate having me on to discuss this, which to me is a really fascinating topic in that we're discussing this. This is the beginning of year 10 for James Franklin. Isn't that something? They're going to start spring practice, I think, in about 2 weeks. This is going to be his 10th spring practice. And you say, is Penn State fully ready to embrace his vision? I think they're, as far as the vision, there seems to be more alignment to do that, than there has been in the past. You've heard that from their board president, Matt Schuyler. You've heard that from athletic director, Pat Kraft. You've heard it from James Franklin. Fiscally, that I don't know. Fiscally and that's going to be the absolute watchword over the next couple of years, is whether they have the money to back the entirety of what James Franklin wants to do. I think in a perfect Penn State football world under James Franklin, there would be an athletic, for example, there would be an athletic dorm complex somewhere on campus that would be there's a lot of ways you can get around it with rules, but that would be primarily, an athlete dorm, a football player's dorm that is state of the art with, apartment style living and kids not cramped into dorms and center halls, east halls, things like that. There would be a football only indoor practice facility. Right now, Penn State football team shares Hullabaloo Hall with a bunch of other teams. I've been in there for events on occasion where, the football team is coming out and the golf team is coming in, stuff like that. There would be, the football building, the last football building, would have more bells and whistles than it currently has now. And there would just be more. They benchmark themselves, not to, I think, necessarily in the Big Ten, to across the board in the Big Ten, but they want to benchmark themselves to Ohio State and Michigan. They want to benchmark themselves against Georgia and Alabama and facilities wise, like Oklahoma, Texas A&M. James Franklin will always encourage you. Hey, if you're out making road trips in these other schools, why don't you stop by and visit their facilities and see what they have that we don't? So I think conceptually it's getting there with the administration, with the board of trustees, with the athletic department. It's just a matter of, do they have the cash to do it? They're making a lot of money. Penn State, their football team made a record amount of money in their last fiscal year. It was a 21 football season. That last fiscal year was $105 million that they made and spent about 57 of it. I think this is the money, this is the football department and an athletic department that we were told in 2020 was going to have some lean years post-COVID. And their last fiscal filing it included their highest revenue and highest cash outlay in history. It's like $185 million, I think, that they took in revenue and spent I'm looking at this. It was $181 million in revenue, $170 million in expenses. So they're bringing the money in and putting it out. And I think James Franklin just says, I think we should have a little more of that for football. He's always going to say that.
Yeah. So a follow up to that, and this is going to go off a little on script here, but you've seen some of these other facilities. Tell us what that gap is. You mentioned Ohio State, you mentioned Michigan. We hear it from Ohio State and Michigan fans, even here in our own building, that, hey, Penn State can't keep up. So how much is there a gap that Penn State and James Franklin should be worried about?
If you've seen Penn State's new weight room, I think it's top class. It's got to be one of the best, if not the best in the Big Ten. But then if you see Northwestern's on the lake, resort style, $200 million, just gorgeous facility, you look at that and say it, again, there's setting that's involved, but that's a world-class football facility. Other universities are investing a ton. I think I just saw Oklahoma. It was Oklahoma or Oklahoma State was investing like $330 million in new all sports facilities and into a new like a full athletic technology performance center, which Penn State actually has kind of on the books as part of their master plan that they released. It was 2017. They were supposed to build an athletic performance center right there and create kind of an athletics district in a way in that Lash Holaba area. Penn State doesn't need to be the university or the athletic department that has, you walk into a building and there's a beautifully lit waterfall in the lobby. I don't think they want to do that, but they needed upgrades in sports performance and nutrition. Those are the kinds of things that they were really pushing quite a bit. The weight room. They're just updating their practice facility. Spent about $7.5 million that they're going to do for things like to put up a net, goalpost and a net on their turf field. Have you ever seen the turf field? It kind of points toward the street. So if you're kicking footballs, they're going to land on, I think it's University Drive or whatever that, just little things. They just need more. Everything is always just, we need more. And that's one thing that James Franklin, that was part of his call to action, that to the Board of Trustees, in which he said, if we want to be leaders, we've got to embrace this new reality of college football, which means in the world of embracing the new world, of college football, we've got to be able to spend, $100 million on football. I don't know where their target number is, but I'm sure he wants that budget just increased.
Yeah, and actually we'll ask you in a little bit about the new reality of college football. But before that, one of the nuggets from your article, Mark, that really caught our eye was that one of the trustees, a pretty famous name, in fact, has shown some hesitation to spending money needed to fully compete, and that would be Jay Paterno. And your article mentions the fact that Jay voted against the recent upgrades to the Lash football building. Now, I guess our question is, is this a problem? The funding, of course, did get approved, but there are a lot of Jays out there that likely think Penn State is, good enough, and where we're at is good enough. And is this mentality going to be a roadblock for Franklin and PSU competing with the Michigans and Ohio States of the world?
In general, I think from a general perspective, yeah, the mentality has been a roadblock, but in that specific case, just to contextualize that,
Please.
The $48 million Lash renovation project, that was the trustees voted on that. I think the vote was like 27-6. It was overwhelmingly passed. They voted on that in February of 2021, which was kind of still right in the crosshairs of a COVID university budget. They were still in, there were still a lot of students, I think, remote doing remote classes, or at least having the hybrid options, things like that. The university was not fully back into, a full campus experience. And what Jay Paterno and the others were saying who voted against that was, we don't think we should debt finance. Now, it's important to say that the university doesn't spend the money on athletic upgrades like that. That's not coming out of the university budget. If you wanted to get into like the stadium, their president, Dr. Bendahuti, made a real point about that, which you can get into in a bit. But that's a self-funding process in the athletic department. They don't take student fees. Unlike a lot of other universities, they don't take student fees. They don't use educational budget or tuition money to fund the football program. It funds itself overwhelmingly through football, ticket sales, and media rights. So to do this, one of the things I think that some of the trustees are looking at, and this was part of Jay's point, is that they were going to debt finance $48 million, which means the university is loaning money to the athletic department. they were doing this during a period of kind of budget volatility overall at the university. I didn't think it was the right time to do that. Other trustees says, well, essentially that money was already spent. We had already budgeted that money. Anyway, we knew we were going to do it. The loan was kind of approved or at least scheduled already, so they knew where they were going. I think some of that was just a way, it was just a way to get a public voice out there saying, should we be spending this, should athletics be spending this kind of money, or should we be funding through debt financing this kind of funding money to the athletics when we're debt financing other projects in the university, and we have we have a university budget that is going through crisis. As I mentioned earlier, the athletic department budget crisis is over. And that's one of the interesting things we heard in 2020. There's going to be years where the budget crisis is going to continue, and it's over. Like I said, that 2022 fiscal year, Penn State made a record $181 million and spent a record $170 million to generate a surplus. That includes the 21 football season, which set a record for football ticket sales. I think it was like $40 million in football ticket sales revenue. So they've come storming back. And I think that's where you get James Franklin is saying we are making, our revenue is out of the 2020 pandemic issue. We are making revenue again. So we need those funding resources. Again, it's not just facilities, but it's for staffing. It's for recruiting staff and analysts and all the people, the infrastructure. That's probably the bigger infrastructure issue for James Franklin. If you were asked James Franklin, do you want to renovate Beaver Stadium or build football dorms and put 35 new analysts on his staff? I don't think he would hesitate to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think
Part two being the answer.
Right. And just a quick follow-up before you ask your next one, Dan, because this is just basically a yes or no, but basically what you're saying is, and thanks for contextualizing that, this for Jay seemed to be about strictly money, COVID, the actual dollars and cents. It wasn't that, oh, my dad didn't spend money this way. This was simply from a trustee standpoint. It wasn't from looking at the past. It seems that way.
No, it didn't feel, and it was more contextualized to the budget issue at the time of 2021, which is definitely COVID related. That was their overwhelming point. I mean, Jay was making points about should we be spending this money when there are students sleeping in the hub? That was one of the things he said at the board meeting, and that was the point I think he was trying to make. It's important to know that, Jay Paterno was one of the founding members of the Success with Honor NIL collective, that he helped get that off the ground with some other really influential trustees. And he was a big voice behind that. So I'm not saying at all that Jay Paterno should ever be considered somebody who is trying to resist a new change of Penn State athletics. He absolutely supports it. He was, again, founded that collective, which is the main collective for Penn State. I think just at that point in time, he was trying to put these two budget issues together and say, should we be spending money here when we have these other issues here?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the NIL because we want to ask questions about that. It's still kind of the wild, wild west. A lot of college football fans are trying to grapple with this. So have you heard any upgrades to those collectives like Success with Honor? And what is the plan moving forward? I mean, can this continue to grow? Can they compete with, say, the SEC where money seems to be flowing? Or even recently, there was a confession, if you will, from Justin Fields that Ryan Day secured all this money for him. And perhaps maybe that's why he ended up being a Buckeye.
It's Penn State is, I think what Penn State is going to fight, and what I've heard for this from the people who run the collectives, is they come up against a wall. It's a wall of resistance in the Penn State fan community at the idea of doing this. Penn State I think it has a fan community, and it comes from the Joe Paterno era, one of the success with honor ideal is that we will run an athletic department in which we're successful athletically. We don't pay players and they graduated. There's various baseline concerns. And so there's a resistance to that. I've spoken with a number of Penn State fans who just ideologically just don't believe in the idea of paying athletes. I mean, first of all, they're coming at it from the perspective of paying athletes, and that's not what NIL is at all. NIL is just athletes being as you know, being able to capitalize on endorsement deals, things like that. And so they're able to monetize what professional athletes can monetize and what some 14-year-old, artists, YouTubers, whatever, can monetize. Athletes are just in this world where they couldn't do this before. So Penn State is one of those universities, and they're not alone in this at all. Across the Big Ten, probably across the Northeast. And I've heard Michigan has just had trouble, has had resistance with this. That the fan base is just reluctant to give into the idea of where they believe is paying athletes, and that's one of the biggest things. That's one of the biggest walls that the collectives face is convincing them that's not what we're doing. We're not paying athletes. They are monetizing their own brands. And I think the other thing is Penn State doesn't have, for lack of a better term, just a real intense, real influential, intense donor or donor base that believes their return on investment of giving Penn State, the collectives, a lot of money is winning a national championship. What Penn State does, and it's a good approach, is saying, Penn State puts out more CEOs, I think, than any Big Ten university, and one of the top 5 in the country in CEOs, and the largest living alumni base, and all these sorts of successful ideas, or successful people behind coming out of the university. A lot of those successful people want ROI on their investments. It's not good enough for them just to say, I'm going to give you $8 million, go win me something. Right. They don't have those people who have a huge amount of money and feel that that's their best return on investment, where there are other schools that do that. There's a great test case just recently at Miami with their collective and getting an NCAA sanctions for women's basketball. Penn State doesn't have that. Penn State doesn't have that alumni base or that fan base that I think really, overwhelmingly buys into this idea. It's either they resist it, or at the top end that they want to go full throat all in on it because they say, this is where other universities are getting, our other football programs are getting their competitive edges. And that's where another place where James Franklin really wants Penn State to go all in on. And that's one of the things he said, that was kind of couched in his message, the Board of Trustees. The new reality of college athletics is NIL. And then ultimately it's going to be, how do they pay players? And he wants Penn State to get ahead of all that. And still, I think Penn State still is, for the most part, they're still behind. At least the programs they're chasing on the big national scale.
Right. And that's where James Franklin wants to be. So, we had mentioned alignment, and let's kind of piggyback on that. One of the knocks against Sandy Barber was, fundraising and maybe squeezing out some of these donors a little bit. So now you've got Pat Kraft coming in here, sort of like a bull in a china shop, which is not a bad thing. You've got the new president too. Is there finally some alignment there? I mean, it seems that there is. You've hinted at that. I mean, what are we hearing about those three people, including James Franklin? Are they ready to take Penn State to that next level? Yeah,
what really struck me at the Rose Bowl is after during the beginning of the victory celebration on the field, two of the first people I noticed, it was very noticeable in getting in James Franklin, or actually getting to the front of James Franklin's hugging line, were Dr. Neely Bednaputi, the Penn State president, and Patrick Kraft, the athletic director. They were right there. They shared long embraces after that game, especially, James and Patrick seemed to have developed a really kind of, from the start, hey, what do you need for football relationship? And he's going to give James Franklin as much as he can, to the point of, not overspending or not going crazy, but he's going to keep James Franklin in a reality too, that, that Penn State has constraints. but they were there. They were visible. They were very visible there. I think they made themselves visible all week too, at bowl events, public and private, fundraising. And that's a huge fundraising opportunity. A Rose Bowl is a huge fundraising opportunity because you can get in front of big donors, and especially in California, if there's some people, some influential people, Hollywood or in any sort of entertainment business that you might want to attract, that, a big bowl game like that attracts people who have money. And it seems like from that alignment perspective, that Dr. Bendaputi, who came from Louisville, understands the concept and embraces the concept that football is the front door of the university. She's the one who made the who made the announcement to the board of trustees about renovating Beaver Stadium and not building a new stadium. Patrick Kraft, he's an all-in 31 sports kind of guy, but he truly understands, and I think he is a real lean-in on the value of having a well-funded, well-operating football program. And he was the athletic director at Temple when Matt Rule was the coach there. And during that time, Patrick Kraft was discussing building a new stadium for Temple football, building an on-campus football stadium that Temple could make good use of, and that would highlight the Temple football program instead of shuttling them out to Lincoln Financial. He very much understands process of Power 5 football. He's played Power 5 football. He played at Indiana as a linebacker. He's also an economic realist too, that he's not going to spend money that he doesn't have. I don't think he's going to go over and above and say, okay, we have a $7.5 million Beaver State, or not Beaver State, but the practice facility renovation project. Well, here's 12. What can we do with that? He very much lives in constraint world of, these are my finances, and I also have to renovate a soccer field, and the swimming team, they need a new pool. All these sorts of things. What am I going to do with the wrestling team? Who wants to get into the Bryce Jordan Center a little more? The wrestling, he's mentioned, like the wrestling team needs upgrades to their weight facilities. Penn State Wrestling is going for its 10th national championship under Cale Sanderson, and they still need upgrades. So he lives in a world where he budgets for 31 sports. Football is his passion project, though, and I think that's what we're seeing here. Now, that alignment doesn't mean that James Franklin's going to get another $18 million to go invest in a bunch of analysts and a whole, a floor of recruiting staff. But it should mean that he's getting a lead. If he doesn't get incrementally more, at least things are getting fast-tracked a little bit better.
Yeah. So going to the players on the field now, and James Franklin's roster coming into this year, coming off the Rose Bowl, going into a season where it seems like the season will come down to 2 games. How is the team positioned? And you mentioned some of these staff members. There's some change too. How does this all come together into next season?
I think they're positioned tremendously to compete in the Big Ten, provided they get the quarterback play that I think they want, need, and believe can happen. That is the overwhelming, most fascinating position to me on that roster, is that they have the recruit, they have the engine, so to speak, in Drew Aller, that quarterback recruit who can be great, who's bred from, his sophomore year of high school when he actually started playing this, full-time quarterback, to now who has physical tools, who has an understanding of the game, who has just the elements of playing the position, but hasn't really played at the extent, that Sean Clifford played. More importantly, he's not led an offense to the extent that Sean Clifford has led an offense. And that to me is I think that is the most important factor. James Franklin has already brought this up, not just across the team, not just at that position, but everywhere. That team last year had such a good core of leaders between Sean Clifford and Jonathan Sutherland, Jair Brown, PJ Mustipher, Juice Scruggs. They had like a players council that they've never seen. It was like a Justice League of leadership,
Right.
components. The personalities of these players lend themselves to leadership potential. I mean, Sean Clifford played as a sixth-year senior quarterback while he basically started and scaled an NIL company, which he recently just sold. That blows my mind that a college quarterback also is running with his brother, Penn State receiver Liam Clifford, is running a company while he's playing Power 5 college football. So that personality you're going to miss. Talent-wise, I mean, my goodness, that, you know, the freshman class from last year, the contributions they made across the board, starting with the running backs, obviously, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. But you can look at, you know, on offense, you had a left tackle play 5 games in true freshman Drew Shelton. Abdul Carter, who showed up on campus in June. I think we were actually there for a media availability. And here comes Abdul Carter walking across the practice field this very first day, from going from, you know, walking on your first practice field, kind of just walk through kind of thing in June, to being, you know, freshman All-American and the big, you know, and I think second team, second or third team, all Big Ten kind of thing. There's so much talent on that roster, physical talent, but where are they looking for the voice? Whose voice is taking over when they need, one, when they need to be rallied, and two, when they need to be calmed down? I think one of the underrated things that Sean Clifford could do was, when you're getting into a position, not just rallying a team, but when you have 2 or 3 3-and-outs in a row, and you start to personalities kind of wedge or fray on the sideline, temper's getting hot. He was good at calming everybody, and that's a huge component of who is being the calming voice, not just the, you know, not just the the hype video sideline people, but who are the calming voices on that roster? That, to me, is how they go from, you know, another 10-win regular season to actually having a chance to beat Ohio State at home. Excuse me, out. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things too that may help with that, OC coming back, DC coming back. You've got Yursich and Diaz, but there has been a little bit of coaching turnover. The wide receivers coach is going to be new, and I think the inside thinking there is Franklin felt like needed a little bit better recruiting, needed a little bit better production from the wide receivers. Now we just learned this week a little bit of breaking news that he's going to need a new defensive line coach. You hearing anything about that, or what Franklin may have in his little black book for a hire there?
I'm sure they've known about John Scott leaving for some time. And I just wrote this morning, there's a pretty good candidate already in State College. It's just a matter of whether you want to take a chance on a 30-year-old essentially rising coaching star in Deion Barnes, who played for Penn State. He was Big Ten Freshman of the Year as a defensive end 2012. Hasn't been a coach, though. He was a graduate assistant. After his graduate assistantship ran out, they found a way to, usually graduate assistants spend 2 or 3 years. I think you've spent 3 years now at a program, and then you leave. If you're a GA at Penn State, you spend a couple of years there, and then you leave and you go coach at a smaller level. You get your feet wet. You learn how to coach a position. Deion Barnes doesn't have that. Deion Barnes doesn't have that experience. He came to Penn State from a Northeast high school in Philadelphia. He's a GA. They promoted him to a full-time spot as an analyst and an analytics coordinator. They love him there. That's a person that they felt was important to keep on staff, to find that analytics job for him. Is that enough? Is that enough for James Franklin to make that move, to make him a position coach? When he hired Marcus Higgins from Virginia as the wide receivers coach, one of the things he said is, I want to develop a receivers position that puts fear in people nationally. Our first time college head coaches equipped to do that at that level. Deion Barnes may very well be. He gets rave reviews from his fellow coaches, from the players that he coaches. But is he seasoned enough there? Penn State, again, they're going to have money to go out and get a successful, established defensive line coach. And it could be an up and coming coach too. I mean, James Franklin's Rolodex does not lack for names of young coaches who catch his eye. He knows enough people in the coaching profession where they will talk about young coaches or established coaches, or whatever, especially young. I think James Franklin likes the idea of harnessing young talent and then kind of letting it go. He's done that with, he did that with Ricky Ronnie. That was one of the coaches I think that he's proud of having hired him at Vanderbilt and watched him go become a head coach, things like that. So I'd be really curious to how he handles that. I think Deion Barnes would be a great, he's a great potentially fit for that job, but the experience level, James Franklin's never hired an inexperienced coach. Marcus Hagan spent 12 years at Virginia. Ty Howell, their tight ends coach, I think he had about 6 years coaching elsewhere, and he was an offensive coordinator in the MAC, I believe it was, before coming to Penn State. So that'd be an interesting one to see. But again, if he wants one position group like wide receiver to put fear in people, he most definitely wants it on a defensive line that has put fear in people over the past 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, I thought about Deion Barnes, obviously, and he seems to be such a key recruiting piece in Southeast PA and the Philadelphia region. But real quick, Manny Diaz, he's been around the block.
Yeah,
he's obviously a very accomplished defensive coach. Perhaps he can recommend somebody, and maybe someone of his style. I mean, they seem to really like aggressiveness. Do you think they could go in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure that's most certainly part of the discussion. I mean, Marcus Hagan's coming from Virginia. I think one of the things that got him in the door was probably a really good recommendation from Penn State safeties coach Anthony Poindexter, who worked with them at Virginia. James Franklin, it was funny. James Franklin did. He spoke at a real estate convention maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and he was telling realtors, it was a pep talk kind of thing,
right, sure,
about transfer some of his 4 core values into coaching or into real estate from coaching. And one of the things he told him was, the resumes are worthless. He's like, I don't look at resumes. And you can't hear the audible gasp. It's like, what? And it makes sense in football that he could have, there could be a ton of resumes that show up on his desk about this job with people with 12, 15 years, good stops and all that sort of thing. But if he doesn't have a relationship with you, or if he doesn't have a relationship with somebody who knows you, James Franklin, I think, is very unlikely to hire you. And that's why I say James Franklin, I think, felt like maybe he discovered Deion Barnes a couple of years ago. Deion Barnes was at a camp at Penn State, and I think he worked with Sean Spencer just as a summer camp and was part of kind of a camp coaching staff or something like that. And that's where James Franklin saw him and developed a relationship. James Franklin is not going to go out and hire somebody who's got just a great resume. That's where Manny Diaz is definitely going to come in. I'm sure Manny Diaz would have some strong recommendations, and he's going to trust Manny Diaz's recommendations on that front, and then test the relationship aspect of it. But if he's not getting real good feedback, the resume, he'll just throw that out. I don't even think quite frankly, I don't think James Franklin has resumes in a desk somewhere. Everything he probably stores about prospective college hires and prospective staff hires is but it's a recommendation or a discussion he had at a coaching convention, the NCAA coaches convention, or at a coaching clinic or something. Maybe he met somebody at a clinic somewhere, anything like that. He gets a nugget. That's a really interesting candidate. I watched him do something, or, whatever. And that's how he will hire this. He's not going to go, hey, this guy won 4 coaching awards in the MAC. I think let's talk
right.
about it. If he doesn't have a relationship with him, I don't think they're going to get a look.
We have to wrap up here pretty quickly, Mark, but two more quick questions. The last one's a fun one, but this one, just tying all of this business stuff together, right? We know that there's a lucrative TV deal that starts next year with a lot of networks, a lot of broadcast networks for the Big Ten. Penn State, and you just pointed out too, which is great stuff, that they're running a surplus here, so they're going to have even more money coming in starting next year theoretically. What are we hearing about Beaver Stadium? And again, there really should be no shortage of a budget issue here with more money coming in, right?
What we know is that, I think we knew back in December that Penn State wasn't going to build a new stadium. I think you're looking at $2 billion to build a new, if you want to build a 100,000 seat college football stadium, which nobody's going to want to do. I think Buffalo just released plans for $1.4 billion stadium. So that was going to be cost prohibitive. It's a matter of who's going to fund this and at what level of renovation they're going to go. I mean, I just did a kitchen renovation, and if I would have done the kitchen renovation I wanted to do, I would have moved appliances and electricity and water and plumbing and everything. It would have cost me 6 or 7 times more than what I really did on the kitchen. So that's, I think, where Penn State is going to go. Are they going to spend $400 or $500 million on securing Beaver Stadium structurally and widening concourses, just doing the kind of the basic stuff that Beaver Stadium needs to exist? Are they going to go higher and seat back the whole stadium? At what point do they start spending money to where the fan amenity factor really drives what they're doing? Seats, like chairback seats, concessions, obviously suite seating, things like that. And what are they going to do? How are they going to approach this financially to make it a year-round destination or year-round venue, and not just to host big events like a soccer game or a Winter Classic or a concert or whatever? But can they add like square footage on just like public spacing with event space, and so you can have weddings and more weddings? The Mountain Indy Club has some, but more year-round events like weddings and conferences. And that's a pretty cool thing to be able to put 50,000 square feet of event space in there. And now Beaver Stadium is a year-round place that you can, that realtor convention James Franklin spoke to in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, can now be in State College instead. So I think they're probably leaning in the direction that this is going to be a significant upgrade, that it's going to be, when Beaver Stadium is done in 10 years, first of all, it probably won't be called Beaver Stadium because it'll have new naming rights because they got to get money. 2, it's going to look completely different. It's going to be a new stadium on the same footprint.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Final question here. This is we are 2 meteorologists.
Yes,
we talk a lot about weather, especially during the season when weather matters. So just a final quick story from you, or a quick thought of, if you remember, what's some of the worst weather you've had to cover a Penn State game in?
There are so many.
That's Big Ten football.
And it's, I have to also come from the position of, whenever people say to me, "Oh, the weather's terrible there," I say, I'm inside.
Yeah, right, true.
I'm in a press box. It's not affecting me, so I don't sit out in the misery of weather. There was a miserable one of the bowl games in Orlando, was absolutely horrible for Orlando. You don't want to go to a bowl game in a torrential downpour in Orlando, that sort of thing. So that's disappointing. But I don't remember some of the, I think it was in 11, maybe, the ice game in October.
Yes.
Was that the Illinois game? Or they kind of run together, but that
was Paterno's last game.
I think so. Yeah, that was a rough kind of getting in and out of the game. I remember one year there was hurricane flooding. So I got stuck on 322 driving up to the game. 322 was flooded. So, and so the road was closed. And so I actually get into State College until 4 or 5 a.m. Saturday morning. But, I always empathize with people sitting out there and say, I don't know how you could possibly do it. I remember the Michigan State game last year. What a beautiful day that was, for late November in State College. And I think, it was close to 50, gorgeous day. And I said, I'm really happy for everybody here. because you get to sit out, in a beautiful day. And, because a couple of weeks last year were really bad. And, the guys who tailgate next to me feel bad for you.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sound like, oh, I've seen so many horrible weather games. I really haven't.
You get the best view of all. Mark Wogenrich, thanks so much. This was enlightening.
This was a lot of fun.
Really great stuff. And we certainly hope you'll come back, but we appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me anytime. I really appreciate having me on.
That was Mark Wogenrich. I want to thank him. Really a fun conversation, a lot of unique perspective, too, coming from the Penn State program, coming from James Franklin, too. I mean, I'm going to bring in Brett Thacker now. I mean, this all started because of the article that I shared with you. And, again, the unique insight out of some of the finances behind Penn State, some of the planning that goes in behind Penn State, and then ultimately the team on the field. I mean, we touched on a bunch of different things.
We did, and quite frankly, Dan, one of the things was too that he talked a lot about the business side of this, which I found very interesting.
Indeed.
And that Franklin really is hammering his point home. I mean, he had some great content in there.
He certainly did.
And we appreciate his thoughts. But my reaction to all of this is that Penn State has money.
Well, and this goes back to something I hear a lot about Penn State and how it will never be on the same playing field as Ohio State and Michigan, and that may be the case. And I've said this to you before, there may be a ceiling to Penn State, and once every 10 years, maybe they break through one of those teams. I think it's going to be hard for them to ever break through both and be undefeated. It's just not the world we live in right now. But there's a chance that Penn State could catch them in some departments. I think, you and I both lived at Penn State. I know the trials of housing at Penn State. It's old. In some places, it's pretty decrepit. And that's big in recruiting. And if they don't figure out that part of it, how they bring athletes in, how they show off, a showcase of the university without sticking them in East Halls or South Halls, and it's a pit.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just going to be blunt.
It's a pit, especially at East Halls, which I never had to live in, by the way.
They did tear down some, but it's not a total overhaul.
No, and listen, first of all, let's get a couple of things straight here, and we're going to take this right from his article and the interview. There should be no excuse about money.
No.
They have a surplus. He talked about from the ticket sales alone.
They recovered straight from COVID.
I brought up the fact that money is going to be flowing in. Money doesn't grow on trees. It sure does if you're the Big Ten.
Hey, listen, there's a reason USC, UCLA, perhaps the Oregons of the world, perhaps Utahs of the world, they see it.
Yeah.
And they see what these universities are getting.
Guess who readily signed up to broadcast Big Ten football? CBS, NBC,
Jumped on
Fox. Guess who doesn't have a TV deal yet?
The Pac-12.
And that's a big problem.
It is a big problem. That could collapse their conference.
If they can't find, okay, let's veer off of this, but let's say that I'm the Pac-12, right? And ESPN is not overpaying for rights anymore. They can't. In case you haven't heard, Disney's in a little trouble. And I say a little trouble. I mean, it's Disney; they'll be fine.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? Their stocks are down. They're looking for ways.
Well,
they can't just spend stupid money anymore.
And they've already overcommitted.
They're paying for the NFL. They're paying for a lot. And notice they did not overpay for the Big Ten.
Right.
They do not have Big Ten rights.
They went to a certain level and stopped.
Now, if the Pac-12 can't get Pac-12 After Dark on ESPN anymore, let's say all of their rights go to Apple TV. Now, I'm throwing it out there.
Yep.
You can make the statement, and this was the Chris Vanini article on The Athletic I referenced last week at the end of the podcast. You can take your rights there, okay? Who's watching?
Well, and some of the argument could be made who was watching the ESPN, too. Well, I know the ratings were down for the Pac-12.
Yeah, well, you can make the argument, does anybody care about Washington State Cal? And the answer is not a lot, but here's the situation. If you're a diehard college football fan like you and me, if that's what's on at 10:30, we're flipping to it.
Sure.
My point is, if Apple TV has all the rights, is it easy to flip channels when you're streaming? It's not.
No, you got to go platform to platform.
Yeah, that's not easy. And if your rights are buried in streaming, aren't you going to become more irrelevant?
Well, and I think if that's the case, the deal is not going to be any comparison to the Big Ten or the SEC. I mean,
so that's what I'm saying. You have two problems. You're not getting money to come in, and then nobody can watch your games anyway or care to.
Right.
So how are you going to stay relevant? Now, Penn State, getting back to that in this interview, does not have that problem, clearly. So we've got the money coming in. There should be no excuse. Now, he made the point, and again, I thought this was very sapient. The there are some folks in the Penn State community and boosters that just can't wrap their head around paying players. Now, like he said, it's not really paying players. You are paying people for their image and their likeness to endorse products. Everybody else can do that. Players should have that opportunity as well. Listen, I'm not saying I like necessarily where it's going. We were just talking to what if the player that you've endorsed and are paying money to for NIL gets injured? There has to be stipulations. I don't like the fact that it's the wild, wild west, but
there's got to be a sorting out process. Yeah.
Do you just want to not pretend like this is happening? You either have to get on board. He made the comment too that Michigan has had some trouble here. They certainly have, but they've done enough.
But you know who's not having trouble?
Ohio State.
Yes.
Guess who else? The Bulldogs of Georgia.
Yes.
The
so
Crimson Tide.
Done.
Actually, Alabama did have a little trouble. They didn't necessarily need it, but they have it now. They're starting to come around. Mm-hmm. And listen, you've got to embrace it. And
this is the year to embrace it because success. Yes. Last year was very successful.
Right.
He mentioned that coming off the Rose Bowl year, this is the time. You got to get all your ducks in a row. I think what James Franklin is doing, the politicking, taking, his pitch to the board of trustees in person, showing them the student athletes, this is the time to pounce.
What I don't understand too is if you want to make money and continue to have a surplus, you need to invest your fan base. You know how you do that? Winning.
Yes.
We talked about this with the Phillies, right?
100%.
You got to spend money to make money. And sometimes going cheap doesn't work.
Yeah. Sometimes trying to outsmart your opponent when you have the resources doesn't work. And the Phillies tried very, very hard to be more analytical, do things a little bit cheaper, build a younger team. Guess what? The Mets surpassed them. The Braves surpassed them. The Braves just did it better.
Yeah, they did. And
you could argue the Buckeyes are doing it better right now. Obviously, Mr. Harbaugh and his Wolverines have something going too. And so this is where the rubber meets the road. And this is a very big season coming up.
Well, and I wanted to get his thoughts, and I'm glad he clarified this. I wanted to make sure I understood why Jay Paterno voted against the football building.
Yes.
Now, he cleared that up pretty quickly by saying this really wasn't, when my dad was here, yada, yada, yada. We all understand what that was like, and we also all understand that there may have been some, especially with Jay, some protection going on there. I don't blame him for that, but my point was it more about this is the way it used to be? And he said, no. This was simply Jay and a handful of other trustees saying, do we really need to be spending this money right now, coming off of COVID, coming off of, wanting to make sure that we have actual money to put back into the university? This was purely a fiscal vote. Now, what's your response to that?
I still think it was short-sighted because, again, we knew we were coming out of COVID, and that year that the vote was no, all of a sudden there was a record profit in tickets, which has now been surpassed again by this season. Again, you got to make the commitment. You got to make the investment. Maybe you hit another roadblock like the pandemic. It's not an excuse, unfortunately, because again, these other universities didn't use as an excuse.
No, by the way, that didn't slow down the TV deals.
Correct.
So, the money's there, and it's not going anywhere.
Now, do I think we're ever going to be having facilities like Oregon or, say, Clemson, which have been featured countless times on game day?
The slide.
Yeah.
You want that slide?
Or the napping room. I mean, I find that fascinating that Clemson has. I
want the Dabo slide.
That would be fun. That would be fun. Put Franklin down there.
The Swinney slide. Yeah.
I just, there is a level I think they can get to that's respectable to the rest of the school. Because, again, when you're up at Penn State, you do look at the football program and be like, oh, that's nice that they have that. I mean, there is that.
No. And you do want that. Now, not every program has to have a flavor, too. Right. Dabo has the slide. Nick Saban isn't sliding.
No.
But he's got other things. Kirby's not sliding. They've got other. You have to keep true to the flavor of your program.
Right.
I don't think we need some of that stuff to continue to be competitive. But there are things that we need in order to sign 2 or 3 more 4-stars or a 5-star. You do that and you start winning games, the big games.
It matters.
And you're going to have people, other recruits want to come.
Well, and the other thing we have to keep in mind, and this has been brought up from some of the kids from bigger cities, is that you come to Penn State and you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. So you do have to have your facilities kind of make up for that. Like, wow, they have this here,
Right.
Yeah,
and I think they've done a pretty good job of that. You don't quite feel until you get a little bit down the road that you're in the middle of a cow pasture.
One tidbit I didn't realize though was that Hula Baja is still shared space.
No, you know what? There
me.
was an article by Audrey Snyder who we had on last week where she talked about. I think it was. And if I'm not quoting this right, forgive me, but I think it was a lacrosse practice or something that was going on, and they had to wait and pick up the nets and the balls, and Franklin was standing around waiting for this. Unacceptable. And listen, this is nothing against lacrosse.
No.
It's nothing. He brought up another sport. What was it?
Golfing.
Golfing or whatever. Nothing. But listen, 2023, and listen, there will be some folks that whine about this, but football's king. Deal with it.
And it makes the money for the athletic department.
Yes, you can play lacrosse because of that football team. So they need their own space. James Franklin should not having to be standing around waiting for the whoever.
Now I knew that
the croquet team to get off the field.
Era. I didn't know it still happened currently.
Yeah, no, I had read that a few weeks ago, and a buddy of mine and I were talking about that, and we didn't know it either until I think it was Audrey that had written about that, and we were appalled, quite frankly, that was still going on. Yeah, and I'm sure James Franklin is appalled.
In this era of big-time football, I don't think it can happen. Now, back to on the field here. So we have an opening, which again reminds me of Sean Spencer because it's a similar timing. It's toward the midway of the offseason, if you will. Spring practice is about to start, and they don't have a defensive line coach anymore.
Yeah.
Going to the NFL is Mr. John Scott Jr.
And this, for me, it kind of came out of nowhere. I'm sure it didn't for Franklin, as Mark alluded to in the interview there, but I was a little surprised.
Yeah, I think what the issue is, the NFL is so worried about their coordinators first and foremost, and the coordinators get put in place, and then they start building their staff. And so, clearly there's a hole here now, and there's someone on staff we mentioned in the interview, Dion Barnes. I still think he is a long shot. It's kind of the feel-good story, but you got to get this right because, as we've learned, pressure makes all the difference. Go back to the game against Ohio State that we did win. It was because of the constant pressure on Barrett that sealed the deal for us.
Manny Diaz probably knows some folks, like you said, that will help align that vision. Now, you still, I'm not opposed to giving a young guy a shot. He's been around the program.
Sure,
Dion knows that. The players like him. You may be on the front of that train getting a guy that may be a future head coach, a future star, and somebody that can come in and, he certainly knows the system. So I don't certainly hate it.
I don't hate it either. This is one you got to streamline. You got to make sure it works. And to me, based on John Scott, the long track record kind of says to me they have to go with experience here. Because the other thing you don't want if you're James Franklin is to set a precedent.
Are you saying experience matters?
Experience does matter, even right here at ABC 27.
Well, listen, I just wanted to point that out. It's going to be fascinating to watch.
Yes.
Now, again, we'll also see how long that takes. I'm sure Franklin wants to make that hire.
And maybe it's someone from the NFL, by the way, because there's guys now on the shelf thanks to these coaching changes. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, but he's got to be a good recruiter, like you said, too. And sometimes the NFL, those guys don't want to bother with that. But speaking of the NFL and coordinators, how about the Eagles? Guys, we finally mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and I said I think this is going to happen within the next couple of weeks. I think we debated a little bit about it. But to me, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that within a couple of weeks, we were going to be sitting here talking about the OC and the DC hires. Mr. Shiner wanted to make a comment on the OC in 1 second, but let's start with the DC. And he comes in from Seattle.
Yes.
High praise from Pete Carroll. What do you make of this? Talk about an important hire because, again, Nick Sirianni runs the offense. We think that's going to be okay. You've got your quarterback. You want to make sure the defense stays aggressive, and there's going to be moving parts there.
Correct. And one of those moving parts, CJ GJ, I just love that nickname. So CJ Gardner-Johnson is still the big target here for whoever gets the job. And we now know it's Sean Desai that got the job. And his background is the Vic Fangio tree. at Chicago. That was his longest stop, Chicago Bears, as an assistant, and became D coordinator. So this is not his first D coordinator gig.
And some could argue or posit that even though it wasn't great, the defense, given what was there, overperformed a bit when he was in Chicago. So that led him to some other places too.
It could be. So Nick Sirianni yesterday in the press conference wouldn't go into what kind of system this is going to be. He even hinted at, okay, we need to kind of disguise things here. We're not going to give away all the goods for competitive advantage. So we have an unknown guy here, relatively speaking, that could bring his own flavor. But it seems like, Shiner, correct me if I'm wrong, 3-4 base. Not a ton of blitzing, so that's going to get the Philly radio guys all wound up that they're not going to blitz. But the idea is you have Hassan Reddick, you have potentially Javon Hargrave coming back under contract. I think he's going to be a priority, and you hopefully. Let's face it, they're going to draft a D lineman. That's what this team does. So to me, it's a lot more of the same. Maybe a little more aggressive. We'll see.
Yeah, if they're not going to blitz.
Well, I think
but there's ways to get around that.
One of the big things has to do with the fact that, he is a 3-4 guy, a Fangio disciple. Like, he likes to do a lot of zone. You want to get pressure with your front four. Sounds a lot like what Mr. Gannon was doing earlier. So, I mean, outside of the Super Bowl, that defense was,
top.
Pretty legit. You
Yeah.
know, so I mean, you just happen to run into probably the best offense, in that
and a great
that
schemer in Andy
yeah.
Reid.
So
and
hopefully
a guy that can run away.
Yeah, and hopefully it's just an easy transition from what Gannon was doing into a similar situation. You still have those corners. Hopefully, safety or two are going to stick around. You know, we'll see what happens here.
And that's the big thing.
You want a guy in this situation to me that can just plug and chug. The team doesn't need a lot of messing. Now there may be some new parts on the defense, but when you went to the Super Bowl, come in, tweak a couple of things, and off you go. It sounds like that's what we have here, but I am concerned with that comment that we're not going to blitz as much, and I realize there's ways to get around it. But part of what made this team so good is look at the sack rate.
Pressure,
right?
Yep.
And all things considered, I keep seeing some of these Philly guys all over Jonathan Gannon. What if the field wasn't torn up? What if those guys on the edge could get around? I mean, Hassan Reddick was on the ground a lot by just falling over himself or losing his footing. It's so hard to know. Would the game plan have worked if the field wasn't a wreck?
It worked for about 18 games, so
right.
Well, yeah, that's a fair point, and you're taking on these Philly radio guys, Dan. And
I think it's unfair because they don't get to the Super Bowl without that defense.
Exactly.
It's just
no,
it's as easy as that.
Again, to your point, you got a guy, even with a bum ankle, you have a great quarterback, probably the best in the league, and they have to face him. And then to your point, it was not an ideal setup.
No,
no. And we're not making excuses. That's just how it is.
And they've admitted that their aggressiveness had to calm down because they just couldn't keep their footing.
Let's go to the OC now, Shane Steichen in Indy, and we are bringing in now somebody near and dear to Jalen Hurts' heart. He's been around, Brian Johnson, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he actually has ties with Jalen and his father, played for his father in high school. Sirianni brought him in as the QB coach because there was a relationship with Jalen, and he's gotten a lot of the credit for Jalen's steps forward this season, being the quarterback's coach. So it makes a kind of natural transition. Someone that, the one thing Jalen's dealt with his entire career from college on is every year it's a new OC. At least this is a little bit of stability, a person he knows and trusts, has a family tie. I think it's only the most logical move he could have done at this point to have some kind of continuity going into next season.
I think it's great. I mean, I think the fact that you could keep this guy, you could promote him. I mean, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to have the next man up, so to speak. And let's face it, Jalen Hurts had a huge rise in potential from year to year. I mean, that has to be a credit to Brian Johnson. A lot of the pundits say it is.
Now, didn't you just argue against that point for Deion Barnes?
I did, but this is a little bit different. At least we've seen a similar position.
Now, but I will say he spent a lot of time in college. I think he quarterbacked at Utah, and then he spent a lot of time as different college coordinators. Jumped into the NFL.
And he was in Alabama too, if I'm not mistaken.
Jalen knows the guy. Yeah, I think you're right. And so I agree with you on that stability, and I think he is the right guy too. And again, I think with Nick Sirianni, some consistency there. He wants to run that offense. It should be very smooth. And again, this is where but you kind of want to cater to the guy.
Yeah.
Jalen.
Yeah.
And they say it's not necessarily catering to him, which I think it's the best of both worlds.
Well, and here's the other scenario too. Maybe Shane Steichen only gets 12 or 13 games under Jim Irsay, and he's out. He could be back with us. You just never know. I mean,
Wouldn't shock me.
It would not shock me. I mean, again, we assume all these guys are going to have success at their next stops, but there's certainly no guarantee.
No.
And kind of a historic hire as well. I think it's the first African American offensive coordinator the Eagles have ever hired,
That's great.
and only the fourth in the NFL.
Wow.
You know,
and
kind of
boy,
a big
if he continues along this path, he's going to have major success. And to me, there's no thinking that this is. To me, there's no way this doesn't work. But of course, we sit here in the spring and we see. But to me,
All
it's
you
got.
need is a healthy Jalen Hurts. I mean,
And you've got the
You said it.
ingredients. Yep.
That's what you need.
You got the ingredients. All right. Mr. Shannon, we're bringing you back in just a little bit. Dan, I want to talk a little bit about spring training with you now because it's getting to be that time. It's exciting. You can kind of feel it. You can kind of smell it in the air.
well, you know what I like seeing? I like seeing Trey Turner coming up to the plate, making easy contact, and the next thing you know, he's running home because they're stealing bags early, and the guys behind him are knocking him in. And
Bigger bags.
Exactly, bigger bags, more restrictions on the pitcher throwing over. So that's the other big rule change, that you can't just freely throw over 10 times in a row that gets everybody booing and carrying on in the stadium. This is going to be a huge advantage for the Phillies. If this guy is hitting leadoff in front of guys like Kyle Schwarber, eventually Bryce Harper, Nick Castellanos, who, by the way, looks like the old Nick Castellanos right now, and that's exactly what you want.
It's just been incredible, and I am so ready. We got a month to go here before real baseball
Did you
starts.
see the stats yesterday from Mr. Zach Wheeler?
Oh, I mean, did the guy is he a
Blowtorch.
Is he a robot? He just keeps getting better.
And I even kind of forgot this. He was delayed coming into last spring.
Yeah,
And so he's had a full build-up now, and he's on time.
he's ready, and it just he looks good.
I know, just shoving 97, free and easy.
Now, I want to bring everybody in here. You don't necessarily need to be a Phillies fan if you're listening to us. We talk about a lot of different things, but Major League Baseball. This is fascinating to me because I've had these debates here,
Yes, tell me.
and yeah, I'm on the fence. I don't know where to stand. I do know where I stand on this. The Ghost Runner sting. I hate it. I hate the Ghost Runner, and
But if it saves your bullpen for the next game,
well, I understand that, and I also understand that. So a buddy of mine and I got into a fight about this because I'm complaining about a lot of the stuff, and he said, "You're the one that says the games take too long. This is the type of thing where," and I said, "No, I understand that." But I said, unless you actually really slow down and think about some of these things, you are yes, you're making the game speed up, but you're sacrificing some quality here. I don't hate the Ghost Runner. I would probably start it in the 11th inning.
now here's my question.
I would give them a full overtime inning and then do it.
Okay, I think that's fair. However, the counterpoint I would make to that is you're a huge college football guy. I don't like the overtime rules in college football because to me it's a layup that you give the ball over at the 25-yard line. Hey, go ahead and score, and then then you got to go for two. And to me it's like, what are they trying to do? They're trying to force a result quickly.
Yeah, I did like college overtime until Penn State, Illinois made us sit through 9 of them. So I'm kind of with you on that. Now, there's no easy answer there, too, because you're trying to avoid more injury and more playing time and all that. So I actually, the point that you made about the bullpen, again, very sapient, very good. But I would give them 1 inning. I would give them 1 inning.
Okay, I see.
And then put it out there. I think it cheapens the game a little bit. And
but it does get things moving.
It does get things moving. And I will tell you, when you're up bleary-eyed at 10 o'clock at night watching the Fightin' Phils, it may help with that. So I'm on the fence, but I think in general I hate it.
Now, I would take it out in the playoffs. It would only be a regular season rule to me.
Bingo. Totally agree.
Because everybody should be on an even playing field there. And then if you do have a super long, extra inning game, then both teams are impacted the next day too, which matters in a series.
No, I think 100%. It's got to die for the playoffs. Now, pitch clock. Okay, we're starting to see this come through now. Again,
like a shot clock.
Let me tell you this. In theory, I really like that idea.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it now in practice, and I hate it.
See, I'm the opposite.
Well, and the reason is because it leads to some weird things happening at the end of these games where. The one spring training, I think the Braves were involved, and they got the guy took too long, and that was it. That was the end of the game.
Oh, that's too bad for the Braves.
Well, I'm not saying that about the Braves. I'm saying I hate how, again, to me it kind of cheapens the game a little bit. Now, listen, I still like the idea of a pitch clock. I don't want those guys standing out there scratching themselves for 15 minutes, waiting to throw a pitch or throwing over to first base. But is there a better way to do it?
Well, I think this is to combat the bullpen pitching change issue where again you're adding on so much time for strategy. So this is MLB's way of saying, okay, we can't limit how many pitchers you're going to use, but we can limit your time constraints. That you got to do this at a faster pace. And to me, it is absolutely the way to go because it's going to get more people involved in the game that, like you said, it's too long, can't be involved, my kids need to go to bed, whatever.
It's true. I mean, those are things I have complained about.
And I just, in person too, I think it's going to be a better game. Now, the complaints are you can't go get a hot dog anymore, you can't go to the bathroom, you're going to miss too much.
You're going to miss 2 or 3 innings. Yeah, but listen, you're still missing time anyway. Who cares?
Right. And that's my point. I want to see it in practice. They've been doing it in the minor leagues, and it's made a huge impact, and I think it's time. You know, it's a very long season now. The point that was brought up yesterday, I heard, which I thought was thinking ahead, by the time you get to July, August, with these guys moving at this pace, does that dog them by the mid part of the season or
well,
two-thirds
right,
in?
and that's another problem. You know, the pitchers have a certain way they do things,
Yes.
and so if you're going to be getting them out of that, they're all going to have to adjust.
Yes.
And this is going to be a season of transition
But it's
for that.
everybody now. I mean, everybody's on the same playing field, so I find it very interesting. Shiner, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I know Zach Wheeler was very vocal about it yesterday, I believe, saying that he's not a huge fan. But I kind of want to go back to the 2009 World Series. Remember when everybody was saying how awesome and how fast Cliff Lee used to work?
Yes.
And it got the hitters off of their game. And
Right.
it was a dominant thing that he had that no other pitchers were doing. And now you're forcing everybody to do it. Now, it obviously worked for Cliff Lee. I'm curious.
And Roy Halladay to
And
some
Roy
extent,
Halladay.
yeah.
And they were both fast workers. But for these guys that do, have the multiple stances and then,
They hem,
your
they
check.
haw,
and
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
It-
needs to be cleaned up.
It
But
is going to work both
it's
ways.
kind of interesting.
It can
you know?
affect the hitters as well. I think that is a good point. One thing is for sure, Keith Hernandez will make that dinner reservation now because the games are not going to take as long.
No, and I think for a TV format, we work in television. We know. I mean, let's just do a basic fact here. We have shortened our feature stories and daily stories.
Quick
Timelines,
hits.
quicker hits because people are on to the next thing already.
Yeah, not only if you're watching us on TV, do you want it to be quick, or at least you have to do the graphics quick. These are soundbite things. These
Yes.
are posted to Twitter
Yes.
and the web and social media. So everything is quick, and baseball has to adapt, and it is. Okay, very quickly, last topic. The broadcast booth is back for the Phillies. Everybody's coming back, re-signed. Tom McCarthy and John Kruk will be in the TV booth. Ben is coming back too, and
Sundays with Schmidt.
yeah, yes, Mikey Schmidt will be back, and I had a chance to golf with Ben, by the way, in the celebrity mid Penn Bank golf
He
tournament.
seems like a really good guy.
He is fantastic catcher too.
Yes, cerebral guy. Yeah.
So that was phenomenal, and then the radio. We've got Scott back and in L.A.
Oh God, that
And
is
Kevin.
my favorite. And Kevin. And
Yep.
Kevin.
And Greg Murphy.
Are you going to ask me the big question?
Well, your thoughts on the broadcast booth? Let me just keep it there.
Yeah. To be polite, I would move the radio guys into the TV realm. They are highly entertaining. If you've never listened to a game on the radio, it doesn't get any better.
Well, and LA used to do TV.
Right. And I think that's the difference. Like, he gets it. And Scott Fransky, there's just something about the way he calls games.
He's the best in the business, man. That
he's
playoff
awesome.
run,
Yeah.
how many different,
I would just go to Twitter,
Bedlam
'cause-
at the bank. I
Yep.
mean,
Yes.
these catchphrases that are going to live
And
on for infamy.
Just great.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Tom is clear.
Classic.
Yeah, but he just doesn't have the it factor for me. And part of it is he's obviously following a great and Harry Callis.
Yeah.
Hard to replace, for
But
sure.
he's
Yeah.
been around now for a decade.
He has.
Yeah,
He
more.
has. When he is calling a game, unfortunately, I hear more about things outside of the game than I do the game itself, and that's what has always
There's
bothered
a little
me.
bit of Crucker in there, too, though.
Yeah, but
which
at least,
is fun.
But at
I
least
like
Kruk,
Joe.
he has the insight and he fills a lot of gaps.
True.
Ben is also kind of lacking that at times. Kruk games are great. He does help McCarthy. He brings out a better side of McCarthy.
Yes, I agree.
But unfortunately, when it's McCarthy and Davis, I'm not sure it's the best pairing. Again, Scott Fransky and LA are the best tandem, and even Greg Murphy too. When I've heard him call games,
Yeah, he's good.
good.
But
we're
these
very
guys-
blessed.
Yeah, yes, we are. Now we'll have to try to get Tom McCarthy on here so you can tell him.
Listen, I was polite. Polite. And actually, I don't mind him with football.
Yes,
when
he
he's-
has been very
yeah.
good with that. He does a little bit of everything, too. He's done some
yeah.
basketball games for CBS and NFL.
I just have my favorite, and
yeah.
again, there are times too where because I have other things going on, I don't even listen to the game. I more watch.
Yeah, and I think that does tend to happen, too. Well, at least they're all coming back because we do like consistency, and especially when there's so many rule changes, that will be nice to have.
Well, and let's face it, too. I mean, we want that excitement to come back from last year, and whether it is Fransky, whether it's McCarthy, I think these guys are going to be at the top of their game because they know this could be a very special season.
Correct. Mr. Shiner, thank you as always.
Always.
We are so excited to have more guests coming on. Dan, why don't you tell everybody how they can find us again and how they can email us?
Yeah, so there we are, meteorologist Brett Thacker. I'm meteorologist Dan Tomaso on Facebook, at Brett Thack, ABC27, Twitter and Instagram, at Doppler Dan, Twitter and Instagram, weatherwagers@gmail.com. If you have someone you want to hear from in your sports world, we'd be happy to reach out to them, send an invite. We've had a lot of fun with these guests that come on, Brett. And of course, we are so close to starting to talk about these upcoming baseball series. Give us 3 more weeks,
Yep.
and we're going to be talking about actual baseball that counts.
I think what we need to do is start to wager on which games are going to be in a rain delay.
Well, that could be very true.
That's gonna be
And
fun.
What games could be affected by snow? It happens every single April,
Yep.
whether it's the Cubs at Wrigley, whether it's the St. Louis Cardinals on occasion, or Cleveland. Cleveland's another place that's harsh this time of the year.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be there, that's for sure.
That's for sure.
Daniel, thank you so much. And our thanks to Mark Wogenrich. Great interview with him. We will be right back here next week. Have a great one, everybody.